Now, the first and most well-known variant of what I will be referring to as the T-34-88, simply for simplicity, is the infamous 88mm flak-equipped version. Now, the person who would find the historical information regarding this vehicle was well-respected modeler Henk of Holland, who states, "This vehicle was in service with the battle group Kynast and was used during the last battle in April 1945 in East Saxony." There's just one problem with this here account. It's all fake. Strangely, a little while after this fake backstory was put out, an actual photograph would appear of the vehicle. Well, guess what? This photo was also fake. It was a Photoshop of an actual photograph of a real German-captured T-34. The only reason I can see that someone would do this is they read Hank's backstory and wanted to create a hypothetical of what that may have looked like. Now, at first glance, this Photoshop job is actually quite convincing, but the longer you look at it, you begin to notice some problems. For one thing, it appears the ammunition is stored on the engine deck, and then also on some small models you can find the ammunition stored on the sides of the engine deck. This is an incredibly bad idea, as all it would take is a single stray bullet to strike one of those little boxes and you've suddenly become fertilizer on the Russian steppes. So already a major problem has cropped up regarding this conversion. Now, as if the prospect of manning the world's largest OSHA violation wasn't bad enough, storing the ammunition this way would mean that additional fuel tanks couldn't be fitted, which means the vehicle's operational range would be severely hampered. Another thing you may notice in this Photoshop is the lack of any real thought put into how the vehicle would be operated. For instance, at certain traverse angles, the crew would have to stand on the sloped hull sides, which for someone like the loader could be a mildly hair-raising experience. The crew is also horrendously exposed, and just to make that exposure even worse, you only have a 14.5mm thick gun shield to protect you. Another thing worth pointing out here in this image is how remarkably untaxed the suspension is, despite carrying an 88mm flak gun in place of the original turret. Now, you could point out that the flak gun weighs 1.4 tons less than the T-34-85's S-53 turret. The problem with the weight of the flak gun is that it's incredibly concentrated, and should result in an unpleasantly nose-heavy vehicle. Now, of course, I imagine the thing that drew the most attention already was the vehicle's height. This thing is incredibly tall. Ludicrously tall, in fact. If we were to estimate the height of this vehicle, it would be somewhere close to 18 feet tall, which if it wasn't already apparent could cause minor issues with off-road driving. So let's recap here. The vehicle's history is a complete mess, and the Photoshop is even worse. But what role would a vehicle like this even have filled if it was real? Some have suggested it could have served as a tank destroyer thanks to its powerful 88mm flak gun, which provided effective firepower even well into 1945. However, the hampered mobility, lack of crew protection, and near impossibility of concealment would result in an overall unpleasant experience for the crew. Some have suggested this vehicle also could have been used as a bunker buster, but this would have been an even worse role for it to fill. So the crew protection is already pretty bad even if you manage to get the drop on someone. Now imagine that they know you're coming, and they have anti-tank guns and snipers set up. Now the final possible role that's been discussed is as a self-propelled anti-aircraft gun, but of course this too is also dramatically unrealistic. The lack of a sufficient platform for the crew would make handling the shells a nightmare. This on top of an incredibly limited ammunition supply would have meant the vehicle's operational effectiveness would have been, at best, marginal. Now, though there is no concrete evidence to show that the Germans mounted a Flak 88 to a T-34, that doesn't mean that other countries didn't try to do similar things. After World War II, the Cubans would mount a 122mm D-30 onto a modified T-34-85. The reasons the Cubans managed to pull this off is that despite the gun being a larger caliber than the 88mm gun, it weighed 4.1 tons less. The Syrians would then also mount a 122mm D-30, although they would take a much more unconventional approach than the Cubans, which was to reverse the hull to allow the gun to be fitted without needing a new turret or superstructure, as well as keeping the overall weight down. Now, the other infamous T-34-88 variant is a T-34-85 with an 88mm KWK-36 jammed right into the turret. The original source for this vehicle seems to come from MC Model Bow, and was then referenced on the now tragically defunct Beutepanzer.ru. According to the surviving description on Tank Encyclopedia, in July or August 1944 at the shipyard in Libau, an 8.8cm gun from a damaged Tiger I was mounted onto a T-34-85. From the end of 1944, this tank was used by the 12th Panzer Division in Courland. The tank's color was kept the same dark green, and a large cross was drawn on the turret for identification. The identification number was supposedly 18. The tank was later given the identification mark 12, and was given the Courland sign. The crew drew 8 white tanks on the barrel and wrote High Comet on it too. However, this conversion is highly improbable. Later on, other sources would embellish this vehicle with features such as a Tiger tank stowage bin on the turret, Notic night lamp, and improvised stowage bins mounted on the hull sides. Somehow this vehicle would even find its way onto World of Tanks console, where its historical description reads, "For the armies of World War II, pressing captured vehicles into service was fairly commonplace. There were unconfirmed reports of a German unit refitting a T-34-85 with an 88mm gun. Allegedly, this tank saw fighting with the 7th Panzer Division in East Prussia, hence the concept of the T-34-88 was born." Now, the possibility of the Germans managing to carry out such a conversion is, I think, best described by Beutepanzer as highly improbable. For instance, the 88mm KWK-36 was an incredibly large gun internally, which led to cramped conditions even in the massive Tiger I. Now imagine taking that gun and fitting it into a turret nearly half the width of a Tiger turret. This issue would only be compounded by the fact that a concept like gun depression and elevation would be a nearly unobtainable goal thanks to the complete lack of space in the turret. Another big issue with this new gun was the fact that it was far heavier than the original 85mm ZIS S53, and would certainly suffer from almost all the same issues as the T-34-100 did. But the absolute #1 nail in the coffin for this vehicle is the idea that such a conversion could be done in a place like the Courland Pocket. The sheer amount of tools and precision engineering that would be required to complete such a conversion seems nigh impossible outside of Germany. Now granted, some people would argue in favor of this vehicle's existence by pointing to the KV-1 with a 75mm KWK-40 that was seen near Kursk in 1943. The only problem is that this vehicle was completed at a time when Germany's logistics had not totally fallen apart. To think that in the chaos of the Courland Pocket, where the Germans were relying mainly on captured vehicles due to not being able to repair their own, makes this whole vehicle that much more unbelievable. In fact, it seems this vehicle may have simply been born out of an extrapolation of the final variant that we're going to discuss today. Now, this final variant seems to be a slightly more plausible vehicle, which is that the Germans simply took a T-34-85 and rebored the gun to fire 88mm shells. Surprisingly, there is a somewhat credible source for the existence of this vehicle, which is an interview with German tank commander Wolfgang Kloth at the 2008 AMPS International Show. During the interview, he stated, "There was an interesting unit in Courland, Panzer Brigade Courland, and they only had captured tanks. They had a Sherman and a General Lee and 2 T-34s. They took a Russian 87mm and took it to the ship wharf and rearmed it to 88. They shot 88 ammunition out of it. They were very inventive because up in Courland your back was against the water, you know." Now, of course, I know the big siren going off over your head right now is the fact that Kloth misidentified the Soviet 85mm gun as an 87mm gun, which may lead you to dismiss his story. However, he actually served in the Courland Pocket from 1944 to May 1945 as part of a Panzerjäger unit. The real problem with this story is that he is the only one to come out about the existence of this vehicle. That doesn't necessarily mean he is lying, It just means that finding proof of his claim is insanely difficult. The big issue with his claim is the same issue we encountered with the last variant, which is the sheer complexity of the conversion. The only way this conversion could have been carried out is if one of those ships in the wharf just so happenly was carrying the right equipment to do it. Now let's just assume the equipment was there. It is possible that an 88mm shell could have been loaded and fired from a rebored 85mm S-53. In theory. The enormous problem here is the length of the shell, powder charge, and the taper of the shell, which if it were mismatched with the gun, could lead to something as simple as loss of accuracy, or in the worst case scenario, the breech block exploding. Another big complication for this story is that the 88mm KWK-36 used electrically primed shells, while the 85mm S-53 used a self-contained primer with a percussion cap. This means that reboring the gun would not be enough to make the conversion actually work, and the sheer amount of work to convert the firing system to make it functional makes this story all but almost impossible. So unfortunately, it appears that this vehicle is either a case of a lapse in memory, a second-hand account he may have heard from someone else, or an outright fabrication. This vehicle, too, likely never existed. So what is something that we can take away from reviewing all three of these variants? All of them suffer from an incredibly large amount of unfixable problems, with 2 out of the 3 vehicles lacking any remotely credible source, and the only one that does have a somewhat credible source is also likely just a myth. While it is possible in theory that the Germans could have done these kind of conversions during the war, it likely would have just been far better to repair the captured vehicles they already had in service and to simply use them. Now look, I know this video was short, I know that it was kind of just out of the blue and random. I've got another video that's kind of in the works right now that should be coming out relatively soon, and will likely probably be one of the biggest videos I've done on my channel. So to be totally honest, this video is pretty much a filler video. Either way, I hope you still enjoy the video, and not really sure what I'll do after the next video, but I guess we'll see what I managed to dig up. So, bye, I guess?